Ich habe mich schon immer gewünscht, zu einem Konzert in die Carnegie Hall zu gehen.
Du weißt, das kann ich mir nicht leisten. Du willst nur ein neues Kleid.
Boris könnte dir helfen, wie er auch mir geholfen hat.
Er hilft jedem. Ich würde mir nie von ihm helfen.
Du kannst dir doch Geld von ihm leihen.
Du nimmst einmal was von ihm und dann nimmst du immer wieder.
Good morning to our Australian friends and good afternoon to the New Zealanders who are joining us today. My name's Alexis Tyndall. I'm the Manager of Digital Innovation here at the University of Adelaide Library. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work in the lands of the Kaurna people, and I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to them as the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands that I'm joining you from, and I acknowledge that their sovereignty was never ceded. I acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country and respect and value their past, present and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. We do have people joining us from across Australia, New Zealand and the wider world, so I'd like to extend that acknowledgement to the relevant communities who are represented here today. And with that, I'd just like to hand over to my friend and colleague, Rowan Payne, who joins us from Digital New Zealand, to welcome us on behalf of our New Zealand colleagues.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Alexis. So my name is Rowan Payne. I'm from the Te Puna Mātauranga o Aotearoa National Library of New Zealand. And I'd just like to welcome you in Te Reo, which is the Māori language. Kia koutou ngā muunga, ngā awa, ngā waka, ngā tūpuna o Aotearoa me te whenua moi moi a e hui hui mai nei, tēnā koutou katoa. That translates as, to you, the mountains, rivers, waka, ancestors of Aotearoa and the land of the dreaming, which is Australia, that are gathered here, greetings to you all. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Rowan. So I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, AI-enabled Glamour Practice, the Technical Landscape. This is the latest in a series of webinars for the Australian and New Zealand chapter of AI for LAM, or the Artificial Intelligence for Libraries, Archives and Museums community. I'd like to welcome back our repeat attendees. It's great to see some of the names coming up for registrations again and again. And a special hello to anyone who's tuning in for the very first time. We were expecting about 60 people registered on the webinar today, so that's really great to see. And if you are interested in further engagement with this community, we'll share some information at the end of the session about how to get involved. I'd just like to let you know that today's session will be recorded and shared online after the event, and we will make sure that link gets emailed to you. And I'd also like to invite you to introduce yourself in the chat window. You should be able to see an icon at the bottom of your screen. That's a great place to introduce yourself, let us know where you're tuning in from, and perhaps share some comments about your interest in the issues that are coming up today. It's also the best place to ask questions. Feel free to post questions anytime through the presentations today. Our great friend Ingrid Mason, who's known to many of you, will be sort of keeping her eye on that chat window and making sure that any questions do come to our attention. But we will have questions at the end of the two presentations today, because I think there's great value in getting Jenna and Kia to join us together to discuss the things that have come up. So I think that's our housekeeping done. We have a couple of great presentations for you today. These two presenters are actually, I would say, a little bit well known in our Glamour community, and I really anticipate them offering presentations on the use of digital collections in our institutions from two different and really complementary perspectives. So just starting off with a PhD in, lost my notes, new media, and considerable experience in various environments using digital technologies to connect people with physical collections in place. Dr. Kia Wine-Smith is now the head of digital at the National Gallery of Australia. He has been Director of Digital Experience and Head of Web and Digital at SF MoMA, where he co-founded the SF MoMA Lab and led the digital efforts of the Museum of Contemporary Art Australia before that. He's joining us today to talk about his experience as the inaugural Digital Collections Catalyst in Residence at the State Library of Queensland. And with that, I will hand over to Kia.
Thanks, Alexis. Awesome. Let me share my screen and I'll start from there. Like everyone else, I'm joining you from unceded First Nations land. In this case, I'm joining from Ngunnawal country, so Guruburi. But I grew up in Darug, Darawal and Gadigal land, and in particular, kind of really understood a sense of place and country through the lens of a couple of very generous elders. And so learning to swim in the Bardu and climb the Bulia of the Darug Nation has sort of grounds a lot of my thinking about place. But the thing that I want to talk to you about today is about Meanjin, about Brisbane, about the river city to the north of where I grew up, and a place that I've come to kind of know and love through engaging with the people who reside there and understand its contours and histories and futures. So I want to talk about a project called Mapping Future Brisbane, and I want to kind of smash through it actually and talk a little bit about digital collections and machine learning, the kind of flavor of the broad range of things that euphemistically called AI that I'm most interested in. So Mapping Future Brisbane. It was part of the 2020 Digital Collections Catalyst in Residence, State Library Queensland, first they offered, and kind of genius person, Brett Tweedy is the second one he's doing this year and it's just kicked off, which I think will be awesome. So I'm interested in maps. I'm a mad map nerd, like heaps of map nerds. And the State Library of Queensland has an incredible collection of maps from the beginning of colonization, like kind of the first theft of land, into the present and in a way, hopefully informative of what we do in the future. And so I sort of fell in love with these incredible maps from the 1800s and the 1900s, things that depict the river really consistently and some that depict the area, but also through the lens of the land that was being kind of subsumed by the growing colony. And this one in particular kind of really resonated with me because the points on the map where the trams went to and go to became a kind of reference point for what I considered to be Brisbane, at least Brisbane for the Mapping Future Brisbane. So kind of where the tram ends in the 50s is sort of where my idea of where the city ended for this project. There was a whole bunch of maps that I could see and a whole bunch that I couldn't. And so the State Library was really generous at getting them out. And my project was really like, what can we learn from the past to understand what the maps might look like in 2030 or 2050 or beyond? So what are the precedents for this? There's a lot of examples. Actually, there's a few examples of machine learning looking at things to do with mapping in place. There's a really interesting project about gentrification where they went backwards in time to train the algorithm to then look forward in time to see where gentrification would occur and test it, set in the past and then push it into the future, which was kind of really smart and really effective. Other projects where other projects where they use machine learning to find all of the maps in San Francisco were there for 5 years. So I'm kind of fascinated by this. And then other more speculative projects, design projects. This is Urban AI from Giraffe, which is a New South Wales-based kind of innovation company in the map and GIS space, and became collaborators on this project, super smart people. And I also have worked in the kind of, I don't know, artistic map space a little bit and collaborated with Stamen Design on a few projects, and not the maps projects, but was definitely influenced by their practice. And definitely if you're interested in maps, look up maps.stamen. It's a fantastic way to kind of navigate novel spaces. And then I'm also a professor of art and design at UNSW, and so my colleagues there have been doing a lot of work in this space as well. So Brisbane is different to the other cities in Australia, in my opinion, in that Brisbane's view of itself and its future is not necessarily hard set. I lived and worked in Gadigal country in what is now Sydney, and Sydney really has a strong sense of itself. I spent a lot of time visiting Naarm and family and friends in Melbourne, and Melbourne is quite set in its shape and its structures. Whereas Brisbane seems to be open to inventing itself and has multiple views of its future, which I thought was interesting. So I started asking people a set of questions based on all of these kind of reports that have been written about Brisbane's future, what they wanted to see. And so I spoke to 50 people and surveyed another kind of 100 or so about their vision for the future of Brisbane, and use that as a kind of foreground, a kind of context for the machine work that I did. Spoke to Indigenous and non-Indigenous people from Brisbane, a lot of artists, urban planners, designers, government architects, bartenders, heaps of baristas, a lot of restaurant staff, Uber drivers, taxi drivers, and then kind of professionals working in this place, like the delivery authorities for the Cross River Rail, people who work in Brisbane City Council. There's our Future Brisbane mapping tool within Brisbane City Council, which is sort of like an e-planning tool, quite different to what I built. Met the people in Brisbane, an open house, and all of them kind of influenced my work. And as you can see, I'm definitely a researcher, but I've got my researcher eyes and I've got my researcher gloves on. I'm being very researchery, because you got to do research before you can do the machine. So some of these maps really kind of framed my thinking, and I wrote about it in a couple of blog posts and then a kind of summary. So if you really want to dig in, it's all in there. One of the things that was interesting about looking at a broad scale at the maps. So this is looking at tens of thousands of maps of Brisbane over many years. And I noted this sort of big jump in the 1880s and again in the 1970s, 80s, where suddenly the rate of mapping in Brisbane increased kind of exponentially. And they tied a massive kind of urban changes in Brisbane city fabric. So like the opening up of new land to prospectors, stolen land to prospectors, given away to white dudes so they can build things to then sell, was really kind of, a kind of moment in time in the 1880s. Also, the rollout of horse-drawn and then electric carriages, light, illuminated streets, sewage, all that sort of stuff. So sudden change to Brisbane. And then in the 70s and 80s, another massive explosion in mapping around the Commonwealth Games and the Expo and all that sort of stuff, but also urban renewal around the riverfront. And right now there's also a massive explosion in mapping in Brisbane, digital mapping in Brisbane. So I want to be kind of part of that. So there's, the maps for the new rail line, there's the maps that are developed by the Queensland Office of the Government Architect, which actually, interestingly enough, when I pitched them, this idea that Brisbane is unset in the eyes of Brisbaneans and the eyes of the country. They opened a report that said the same thing that they'd produced some years earlier. And so I thought I was being innovative, but they already knew that. And then I said, oh, this map from 1957, really perfectly shows you where kind of the contours of Brisbane are. And so they flicked a few pages over and they showed me this, which I took a photo of. That's the Malcolm McDowell's the government architect's fingers at the top there, showing me the map that they developed that actually tracked really closely to the ideas that were emerging through the historic maps. So I knew I was on the right track. I was fascinated by this, by the river that ran through the middle of it. So working with some peers, I created a company called AX Interactive. They built me a tool essentially to allow me to align all of the rivers of all of the maps and then kind of suck them out and build something that I could then train a StyleGAN algorithm with. So we looked at kind of all of the maps of Brisbane. I was able to suck them all out based on whether they had a river running through it and align all of the rivers. And then I trained a StyleGAN algorithm with those maps so that it kind of iterates over these sort of multiple infinite potential views of Brisbane based on these historic maps. So you can see the colors have that kind of texture of the 1800s and early 1900s. The rivers in the middle, there's moments where it kind of goes bluer, but often those maps are black and white. And you can see these rail lines, so those kind of fingerprint markers that run through it. But because it's based on the maps of Brisbane, like the maps of Brisbane that exist, it kind of has to represent that in a way. So it has to it can't travel too far from the way that Brisbane is now represented. So I got really excited about that. And then I found this incredible kind of catalogue of maps of the entirety of Queensland, thousands of them, taken over sort of 15-year gaps, generated over 15-year gaps and over 50 years. So, I think I had like 3,000 or 4,000 maps of Queensland. So I stripped those out of their context. So I took them out of their frames and I made them, I normalized them. And then I found this really lovely StyleGAN 2 model of etchings and drawings of birds. And so I took the bird drawings and I trained them on maps of Queensland and I built my kind of infinite Queensland map generating engine. So what was kind of cool about this and the kind of engagement of the library is that they then collected the model, they collected the outputs and they collected the process, like the training data, so that they have now within their collection, which I kind of think is an interesting idea, within the State Library of Queensland collection is a model to generate infinite maps of Queensland based on historic maps of Queensland, the same for Brisbane, which I think is an interesting idea. So they didn't just collect the outputs, but they also collect the kind of infrastructure that made the outputs possible, which I think is a kind of progressive approach. They also collected the maps that people made. So then I started doing things like jamming those maps back into the original context. So this is an example of what would it look like if Russell Island was designed by a machine that didn't know that you couldn't put like roads in the ocean. And then I did the same for the map of Brisbane. So it's a map of Brisbane from the, I don't know, 1970s, perhaps, 1950s, 1970s. And I just placed back one of the machine generated maps on top of it, which was kind of fun. So that's the end of that project. But then that's the end of the machine learning part of that project. But the next model I want to make was about how people can imagine their future of Brisbane. So I took APS data of population density for all of the ABS2 size, so that's sort of suburb level, and then used all of the interviews, conversations, and research that I'd done about where the trams were in the past, where the roads are going in the future, where the university planned a new campus, where development approvals have been made, and created a kind of multiplication, a dependent multiplication factor for those different areas that would create a different model for 2036 than the ABS came up with, because theirs is kind of linear and mine was based on all of these interviews. And so I created a model for Brisbane and then allowed people to basically design and build their own maps of Brisbane. So you should never do this, but I'm trying to do a live demo. Let's see how we go. So here's a live demo. Hopefully, oh, actually, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to share my live demo so that you can all see it. So this is Brisbane based on the 1957 map of all the places you can kind of see it from, and you can view it from any angle. So again, if you just search mapping future Brisbane, you'll get to it. So hopefully this doesn't crash. And then you can create the density that you want. So you can say, well, actually, I want a less dense center and I want to build up the suburbs, or actually, no, I like kind of how it is now and I want a really dense center and not much happening elsewhere. So you kind of own that, but you can also, if you want, create some green space. So I click this. So say you just want to like build a really big park right in the West End. You can totally do that. So now I've got a really big park in the West End, and that actually takes all of the people who lived in that and grows all the buildings around it by a tiny amount, so that all those people now have new homes or have been relocated into South Brisbane, South Bank, West End. And then you can save your map and you put your name and email, and the State Library is actually collecting hundreds of these that people have made, which is pretty awesome and weird and wonderful. And so all of this is possible because of Giraffe. They built the tool that sits underneath it, super smart, and actually did a sampling algorithm based on the model that I made for the future of Brisbane. They made a sampling algorithm that takes all the buildings that exist and then knocks some of them down and replaces them with bigger ones in order to accommodate new populations for 2036, because there's an enormous influx into Southeast Queensland, fastest growing part of the country. So that's the live demo bit, and I think went okay. I don't see any sort of raising of hands to tell me that it didn't. Fingers crossed. And then I'll go back to share my screen to the PowerPoint again. So you can find it that URL, but if you just search Mapping Future Brisbane, it's the first thing. Here's some that people posted on Twitter. So this is one that someone posted that they called River Green Wedge, where they built this huge park through the middle of Brisbane, and that meant therefore that the areas around Brisbane needed to accommodate all of these new people who are kind of in their design for 2036 were displaced, which is sort of fun. And then you'll note down the bottom. So this is the thing that actually this is the image you get. We send you a small one straight away, but you've got a link you can click on if you want a printable size. You can print it and frame it if you like. If you're that nerdy, I've done that, but I can't imagine others. Anyway, it's there if you want. But I also created a logo because I'm that guy. So this is from the Office of the Future Past and the Department of Mapping and Speculating, based on a couple of combined logos that I found on these beautiful old maps in the State Library's collection. So I've got like 5 more minutes, and I just want to make a couple of points before handing over to Jenna. So the machine learning and digital collections piece. If you search machine learning and libraries or machine learning and museums, you get these amazing Google image search results or DuckDuckGo image search results, which are hilarious. I love these. They're stupid and they're funny. There you go, AI and libraries. Because if we're going to invest in AI for libraries, what we should definitely do is train a robot to read a book with their eyes. That's definitely the investment we should make. Or we should trade an animation of a robot to read with their eyes. Or we should have books and turn them into ones and zeros. So there isn't actually, in many cases, like a really progressive thought about what this space is. A lot of it is speculative. And so I think the AI for LAM community, here, Australia, New Zealand and abroad is fantastic because it allows us to think differently. There are some projects that I think are worth looking at in this space. So this is an example where they use computer vision to find things. And because of computer vision is based on, the history that you train it with, it's based on the past. It was trained on photos of pictures, not paintings of people. And so this is a boy holding a teddy bear because nothing in its database had this idea of a painted child. So it just kind of looked like a fuzzy teddy bear. Or when you search for cherubs based on the machine vision, because the machine vision isn't trained on art history, it isn't trained on art practice, it isn't trained on the right collection. You can only look for what it's expecting to find. There are some other experiments like the Henry Ford Museum is doing some really interesting stuff in making linking and making connecting, which I think is worth looking at. But there is a danger in this work that you end up by making everything flat. And I think that is the opposite direction of where I think this sector should be going. Simply making everything flat is sort of in a way disrespectful to the work of the artist. And I'm not sure that's a kind of legible and meaningful experience to an audience either. Some of the things I think are really interesting is when you can build on kind of sequence of practice. So at Met Open Access, they opened up 400,000 images from their collection, partnered with Microsoft and MIT, and did things that actually had humans and machines working together. So the machine tagged it and the human then interacted and the machine got smarter. And I think the human-machine collaboration is a really interesting space for us because, and this example I've used before, if you've seen me giving talks in this space before, when we asked the machine at SF Moment to train itself on this and tell us what was in it, it got that there were people, it got waving, got children, got streetscape, but it didn't get New York, didn't get pregnant, and didn't get taxi. And so we can tell they're waving a taxi, the computer can't. We can tell she's pregnant, but the computer can't. And so I think that human-machine collaboration is really key to how this work can happen. The human-machine collaboration can hopefully also avoid some of the pitfalls like accidentally making a racist selfie app because you base it on art history, which Google did a couple of years back. Or when you want to build an artwork and sell it, which went really well for Christie's, because it was based on art history, it essentially did a self-portrait of a rich white dude, because art history in a way is a representation of how rich white dudes see the world. So there are kind of pitfalls to using these tools in the wrong way. And so for me, I really think that the future for this sector isn't set. The tools are available. Some of the things I showed you, I did in an afternoon, but we should be using them wisely. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Kia. That was the self-portrait of the rich white dude. It says something about what's in our collections, doesn't it? I will encourage everyone again, if they do have questions, please post them in the chat window, and Ingrid will make sure that they come to our attention, even if we overlook them. And we will have a look at questions after Jenna's presentation. So just to roll straight on, I'd like to introduce Jenna Bain, who is the State Library of New South Wales Digital Projects Leader. She works on a wide range of projects that aim to improve the accessibility of and engagement with the library's collections. Jenna hopes to make a positive contribution to the Australian cultural heritage landscape by exploring opportunities for meaningful connections between community and GLAM institutions through technology. So I will hand straight over to Jenna. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexis and Kia. I'll just get my screen sharing sorted out. So hopefully we're all good. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. So hello, great to be here today to talk to you about a library project. I'm coming to you from Dharawal land in South Sydney, and I like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this beautiful place that I call home, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. So the project that I wanted to talk to you a little bit about today is called Tiger, and it's our experimentation using ML and AI to describe our pictorial collections. But before I get into the detail of the project, I just wanted to give you a little bit of context about the library's collections. So we have over 6 million items in the archives, so that's original materials. And we have digitized less than 10% of the collection, but we already have over 14 million master files. So there's a lot in the collection. It's a big archive. And even though all the work that we've been doing with digitization is amazing, digitizing something doesn't necessarily make it automatically more accessible. And so one of the challenges that we've created for ourselves is how do we provide avenues for people to get into the deep detail of the collection, especially when we're talking about a collection that's so big. And so a lot of the work that I do at the library is really about how I can facilitate meaningful engagement for people that are looking to, explore with the collection or use it for research and study purposes. And we've got this huge data set. So how can we use technology to help enable those meaningful experiences? So for us at the library, because of the size of the collection and because of our capacity, we typically catalogue at what we call the item level and not the file level. This is very typical cataloguing practice. So the idea is that if you have an album of photos, we catalogue at that level, but we don't typically describe in each individual photo within the album. So what that means, like in this example, this is a series of photographs by Frank Hurley. So you can see that the subject headings that have been applied to this album are things like zoo animals, corroboree, Northern Territory. So they apply to the album as a whole, but we don't have descriptive terminology that describe each individual image within the album. So we're not seeing things like lion and flannel flowers and river and that kind of detail. So that context is how the TIGER project was born. So TIGER stands for Tagging Images Generically for Exploration and Research. We love an animal acronym and we found one to fit. So the original intention of the project was actually not the TIGER component, which I'll talk a little bit about, but we were just originally trying to find a tagging service, a commercial off-the-shelf service that would best suit our collection material. And we trialed a whole range of different services, some that were paid, some that were free, and to try and see what results we would get back. But what we found really early on was that we were seeing really interesting results across a spectrum of services rather than one being a standout that was most suitable to our collection. So what we ended up doing is building the TIGER component, which is an algorithm that we custom built that analyzes so we run all of our images through 3 different commercial off-the-shelf services, and then our own algorithm analyzes that raw data and then comes with a set, like a subset of the full raw data that we get from each image. So the idea is that the algorithm is trying to identify the most relevant and the most accurate tags from the raw set that we get from the services that we use. So the algorithm that we've built is a rule-based system. This slide makes it seem really simple and straightforward, but this was actually a huge amount of work. It took us months to get this kind of this recipe going. So the idea is that it's very much mathematically based on the confidence level ratings that the services provide when it comes to the different the tagging services we use. And it relies heavily on repetition and duplication of terms as well. So we take into consideration how many of the services got the same tags or similar tags, and we try and ultimately reduce the amount of overall tags that we have with the hope that they'll be more accurate. So here's an example from the collection. So this is an image from the collection, and these tags that you're seeing are the TIGER tags. So this is the results that we got after that kind of synthesizing of the raw data. So the number that you see for each of the tags represents the confidence level rating that the service had in its accuracy. So basically, the higher the number, the more confident that the service was that the term is accurate. And confidence doesn't always necessarily equal accuracy, but the higher the number, the more likely that we're going to get a match that suits the image that we're working with. So they're the tags that came through the TIGER process, but if we didn't have the TIGER process, these are the amount of tags that we would actually be delivering to the user from the raw services. So you can see that we've got like a, sort of a long tail of confidence, and we've got terms there that are less than 10% confident. And we can see that in this image, there isn't a locomotive or a steam train, so they're not accurate. So the idea with the TIGER process is it's really trying to remove as much of that white noise as possible. So how this works in a research context. So this is a screenshot of our current catalogue, but we're actually in the process of replacing it. So we're building a new catalogue that's going to be released soon. Well, it's already released in beta. So the idea is that based on the current research practices, so this particular collection, which is a series of birds from the Derby collection, paintings and illustrations. So this has been catalogued at the album level. So we've got Art Colonial, Birds New South Wales, things that describe the album as a whole, but we're not seeing descriptors for the individual species or features within the albums themselves. So in the current catalogue, as a researcher or as just a user of the library, I can do a catalogue search and get myself to this point, which is the digitised images within the album. And let's say that I'm interested specifically in researching pelicans. So I can get to here through a typical catalogue search, but then I have to manually search through the images themselves to find the pelican rather than any of the other birds that are in this collection. Whereas with the Tiger process, we're able to run all of these images, and you can see that this one has been successfully tagged with pelican. So now with our new digital collections portal that we've been building, to find this image simply takes one search with a single term of pelican. And not only am I getting Derby's pelican as my first result, I'm also getting to see other pelicans in the collection as well. So it's trying to reduce the time and energy that a user needs to invest in terms of getting to the results that they want. And it's also exposing that lower level of detail that we haven't been able to expose in this way before. So using the Tiger terms is a really nice way of seeing the breadth and the depth of the collection as well. So for example, so this tag with Cynthia subgenus, so butterfly, it's a really nice example showing a cross-format approach. So we're seeing drawings, photographs and paintings, which is really nice. It's also a really lovely way to see collections based on a date range. So we're seeing contemporary material alongside archival material for this particular example of swimming pool. And we also get to pull out really interesting, very weirdly specific details, such as small to medium-sized cats. So, it does actually, it's got some really intriguing results with some of the things that we're seeing through the tagging services. And we do have a lot of cats in the collection. So one of the really important tenets of this project was the approach that we were taking in the relationship to traditional cataloguing. It was really important for us to express that we're not trying to replace a traditional cataloguing process. That's not the intention of the project. It wouldn't be possible. There is so much expertise and knowledge and interpretation and cultural and contextual understanding that is required as part of a cataloguing process. So we're really trying to build a programmatic process that complements the work that is already done from a cataloguing perspective. And this is a really nice example of that. So this image from the collection was already tagged through the cataloguing process with Elizabeth Bay House, but that was the only tag that it had. So by running this image through the Tiger process, we were able to identify that there is a wedding gown, a dessert, and lots of really interesting detail about the context of the image. So if you think about this from a research perspective, suddenly we're making it so much easier for a user that, let's say someone who is interested in researching weddings that were held at Elizabeth Bay House, we're now making that the bridge to find this material much shorter and much quicker for people to get to that level of detail. So at the moment, we make the tags available on our digital collections portal. So another really important decision that we made at the very beginning of this project, which is a couple of years ago now, is that any tag data that we were creating would not be made available in the library's catalogue. And there's a range of reasons for that, but the main one is a data integrity issue and a quality assurance issue. So we were not confident, because this project was so experimental in the beginning, we were not confident in bringing this sort of machine generated data into what is the library's source of truth system. And that makes total sense. And so we started experimenting with other ways that we could make this tag data available. So we were already working on a project building our new digital collections portal. So that is where we've made the tag data available to date. Now that we're a bit more matured with the project and we've made a bit more progress, we are now having conversations about, well, how might we be able to incorporate this data into the actual library catalogue rather than relying on digital collections to be the place where people use this data. And one of the challenges with this approach, which is where we're making the tags available on individual pages, is that it's sort of starting with a narrow end, and then so I can come to this. So I need to know what looking for to get a result. So once I'm here, then I can select one of the tags or the, you know, one of the filters down here. And so say if I clicked on dessert on this particular example, it would then take me to a series of results with lots of other material that has been tagged with dessert. So I'm starting at the narrow point, and then I'm having to widen my search and then go out further to look at other parts of the collection. And that's sort of the same in the search experience as well. So so here in this particular example, I've searched for surfing. So I've got my list of results there, and then you can see on the right-hand side, I've got a list of tags that are relevant to my search. So through this tagging process, we have now created tens of thousands of tags, but in the search experience, I'm only exposing the top 20 most relevant tags to the user. So even though we have this big corpus of data, we're still only people kind of have to know exactly what they're looking for to then expand their search out further. So what I was really interested in is how we could flip that and start looking at it from the wider approach, where you start really broad and then you can funnel down. And the challenge with the tags that we've been creating is that there's no hierarchy, there's no structure to them. It's just a bucket of terms. And so with this process, what we've kind of, you know, inadvertently done is created another huge data set of material, of data that is really hard to penetrate for a user who doesn't know what they're looking for. So what we've started doing is looking at how we can create taxonomy trees using the Tiger data and trying to bring more structure and contextual information into the terms that we've got. So this is a sample from the Library of Congress Thesaurus for Graphic Materials. So this is a very a common cataloging standard that's used around the world. So the idea was that we use this as sort of a foundation, and what we wanted to do was do a one-to-one mapping from all the Tiger terms that we have to see how many actual exact matches we could get in this tree, and see if we could build our own tree from this basis. So we did that, and we actually got more matches than what I was expecting. So we actually got matches to around about a third of the term. So this is exact one-to-one matching, which was really interesting. And so what that means is that we've now created this structural contextual tree where users can start broad and then, you know, get more refined and move down the tree, and they can see terms that are related and linked by this structure that has been built off a foundation of a third-party data source. So this was really, really interesting, and it already started to create these pictures of what we have in the collection that we haven't really been able to paint before. But there was a lot of orphan terms as well as part of this process. So we did get lots of matches, but we got lots that didn't match. And from the orphan terms that we found, there were actually lots of terms in there that were really similar or really related to these trees we're experimenting with, but because they weren't an exact one-to-one match, they didn't end up in the tree. So the second step that we took was using a process of natural language processing called stemming, where we started to try and match synonyms to reduce the overall amount of orphan terms that we had. So in this particular screen, all the orange terms that are highlighted are the additional tags that we had from the Tiger bucket that we were then able to map structurally to this new tree that we've created. So the idea is that we're now, you know, making as big a tree as possible that has context and structure and relationships and synonyms that will ultimately make it much easier for users to start at the top and then filter their way down through the collection. So we've made some really interesting, you know, had some really interesting progress, and we've got some really interesting results from the refinement that we've been doing, but there are still things that are coming through that we haven't been able to resolve yet. And this is a really good example that I like to share because, so we have a lot of coins and tokens and medals in the collection, and they're all being tagged with a really high level of confidence that they're rugs. So this was a little bit bewildering for us at the beginning. We couldn't figure it out. And then we realized that one of the services that we're using happens to also have one of the world's largest e-commerce platforms, and they sell rugs online, and they use these images as part of training their algorithms. So if you've ever shopped for a rug online, they are often shapes, textural shapes, photographed on a white background. And so algorithmically, in that context, it kind of makes sense that why these things are being tagged with rug. And obviously, we know as human beings that this is not a rug, and we can interpret this image and understand that is an incorrect tag. But it creates a really interesting challenge for us in terms of solving this programmatically, because it's not as simple as just removing rug or adding rug to like a blacklist of redundant terms, because we do also have rugs in the collection, so we wouldn't want them not to be tagged with rug if it's an accurate term. So trying to deal with these biases that come through the different services that we're using is a really interesting challenge. And so if you were to search for rug right now in digital collections, you're mostly going to get photos of coins. But what this has presented to us is an opportunity where we might be able to do our own custom training of algorithms specifically around different formats that have been highlighted where there's a particular gap in the services that we're using. So this is kind of, we've flagged this as an option for something that we'd like to experiment further with down the track, which is actually doing our own custom training of an algorithm that specifically can analyze coins, tokens, and metals and that kind of material. So we've done quite a lot of work. There's still a lot of work to go, but ultimately what we're working on is just trying to continually refine and improve the data that we've created. So the initial sort of, ML AI process that we did of the tagging was really just the first step for us. And because we are so, we're really invested in providing the most meaningful experiences for users, but also the most accurate data that we can possibly provide. We're doing these continual processes of refinement, and we've still got a lot more that we'd like to do, including exploring mapping specifically to library subject heading. So that's kind of the next space that we'll be moving into, which is training our own algorithms. But what I have found so interesting about this project is, I've worked at the library for a long time, but in the last couple of years working on this project, I really feel like I know the collection better than I ever have before. It's exposed me to parts of the collection that I never knew existed. I get that same feedback from other people about, oh, wow, I didn't know the library had X, Y, or Z. And they've been able to find those things through using the tags and through using digital collections. So it's been a really delightful process, and it's sort of refamiliarized myself with the collection of an institution that I've worked at for a long time. So if I can have those experiences, I hope that we can facilitate those experiences for others as well. And hopefully that experience will just get easier and better and more refined as we continue the work we're doing. So that was everything from me. Thank you so much for listening and for that flying visit. And I guess we'll hand back over for group discussion and questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jenna. That was fantastic. It's so interesting to me to see that we work out these different ways to say that our search interfaces are difficult to use, then we make them broader and bigger and giant, and then they become more difficult to use. And then we still haven't refined, the perfect way of searching our digitized collections. And I think perhaps the process is the thing we're getting out of this, and it's really pleasant. It's also good to confirm that people have always been keen on photographing their cats. Not have historical evidence for the fact. There must have been great presentations, because two of the questions that have come through in the window here are both about whether other collections can use these sorts of technologies. So one is about whether the Tiger process or the Tiger is open source or available for other institutions to use. And the other, and I feel Kia has already replied to this a little bit in the response, is about how people might start doing similar mapping. So Jenna, would you like perhaps to just comment specifically on Tiger, and then Kia, if you've got any tips for how people could get started in this area, that'd be great.
Yeah, so it's not open source at the moment, but it's definitely on our roadmap. So we're, as part of the digital collections portal that we've been building, we're also soon to be releasing our new collections API. And so we're looking at how we might be able to incorporate the tag data. Will absolutely be available as part of the API, but the process involved in creating the tags is not yet available. But it's definitely something that we're interested in exploring. I think we've just probably got a little bit more refinement to do before we let the tiger go too wild.
Oh, you've got to lean into your acronym / animal metaphor. I think it's fantastic. I want to ask Jenna about AAT, but we'll come back to that. Yeah, I threw an example I threw a link in the chat. I think there's an interesting kind of space opening up online about using StyleGAN to do things that are kind of weird and strange, and there's a really fantastic community in Slack called Artificial Images, and there's a whole bunch of there's a whole bunch of YouTubes that put up about how to train up artificial image generating things using all the different permutations of StyleGAN. I did most of it on my machine, which is sort of like like an incredibly beefy laptop that's designed to do these sorts of, complex and hard to do things. Interestingly, there's now products like Runway ML, which is Runway Machine Learning, which is a web-based portal where you can actually do a lot of machine learning experiments for a few dollars, for free, or a few dollars, with no technical skills, which I think is a really interesting way. I think of it as sort of artist prototyping. So you can try something in a kind of compressed time frame in a simple way, and then work out whether or not it's worth sort of investing in. I use Tableau for this a bit. Like if I'm thinking of doing a visualization, I'll do a sketch of it in Tableau, basically. Like I'll get a sample, put in a spreadsheet, attach a Tableau, smash around, see if I'm on the right track, and then if I'm on the right track, then invest the energy in it. So I think there's a lot of prototyping examples out there. And another one, if you're interested in text, there's a woman who trained a recombinant neural network to tell knock jokes, and I saw that and just thought it was amazing. And so then I used the same strategy to write conference papers for myself based on the history of conference papers. And so there's just lots of examples of people who are doing this first and are kind of learning through doing and can share that. And so my approach to everything is like prototype with other people's things as quickly and simply as you can, to get an idea if you're heading in the right direction before you invest any genuine energy, because often you can find that you actually you're on the right path or not at all, and save yourself months of work in an afternoon of experimenting. So that's how I encourage people to start.
Keir, did you say that you had a question for Jenna?
Yeah, at the National Gallery, we've tagged quite a lot of our collection using AAT, the Getty's Art and Architecture Thesaurus. And it's interesting seeing your thesaurus feels a bit more bespoke. And I'm just curious about your experiences with that, because some of the kind of cascading and nesting and relationship stuff just kind of comes for free if you use AAT. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so we actually looked at AAT, but what we found was that a lot of the terms in any of the Getty vocabularies were too specific too sort of format specific, and there are a lot of art-based terms, which makes total sense for your collections, but we found that they weren't going to be super suitable for a lot of the collections that we have in the tags that we were seeing, or rather the tags that we had produced from the Tiger process were too generic to match a lot of the Getty vocabularies. We also looked at the Australian Pictorial Thesaurus, which I'd be crucified for talking about publicly, because it's been, it was decommissioned several years ago now, and it was an Australian specific cataloguing standard for tagging. And unfortunately, it's unfortunate that it's been decommissioned, because it's actually the most relevant match that we could find. So we went through a whole range of different thesauri, including just some open source ones that are out there. There's lots of different Python libraries too. In the end, we landed on the Library of Congress one because it's supported, and that's kind of the biggest thing, that it's supported and it's constantly updated. And then it was seen to be the most relevant match to our collections. But then we also have to deal with things like nuances around language, like, American versus Australian English and stuff like that, which is actually quite a challenge. So even the example that I showed, like they don't use railways, they use railroads, like just that kind of nuanced language that we have to take into consideration as part of the stemming process as well.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Like we use APT a little bit, but again, like it's there's a sunk cost to that that you need to acknowledge. And obviously AAT being a visual arts organization, so Getty's Art and Architecture Thesaurus, so explain your acronyms, is sort of really useful for the work that we do because it's contextually relevant. But the thing that's problematic about it is it's super Western. And so being the National Gallery of Australia, we don't just collect work by Australian thinkers, makers and doers. We really invested in the art of our context, so Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, areas around there. We actively collect. We obviously collect from people who are diasporic of those communities, and we collect we have the largest collection of First Nations art and artifacts in the country. And so AAT it's just rubbish when it comes to not white people stuff. And so there's just these really big gaps in it that we kind of we fill in our own ways, but it's sort of important to note that almost like who gets to tell the story, it has all the agency, like who gets to choose the tags in a way, who gets to choose the language through which we look at things are, are frighteningly powerful. And if we conform to those, then it's sort of like a retroactive kind of tagging colonialism or something that's not healthy, in my opinion.
Yeah, I get that. I get asked that question a lot about the Tiger Process project in terms of, any cultural biases, or especially cultural biases, but biases in general that we see come through. But what's really interesting with the project and the results that we've seen, and it has a lot to do with the services that we use, because we're using, 3 of probably the largest commercial services that are out there. The tags are almost so generic that I literally don't have a single example where I've seen any kind of, even though we have very colonial collections, we have had no examples of racism or, whitewashing, even though we know that content exists in the collections. But when it comes to the tags that have been applied to the collections, I think there's a couple of reasons why we're not seeing those kind of results. One, because we're using such broadly trained, services that they're not getting to that sort of level of detail of, racial profiling, that kind of thing. But also we're not doing training across what we have deemed as sensitive materials. And so that is a big part of it as well. So a lot of the collection that we're uploading is all very similar stuff. Lots of manuscript collections of, flora and fauna and that kind of thing, and lots of photographic collections. But we don't provide open access to things that have been restricted for whatever cultural or sensitive or privacy reasons. And because we're not tagging with that material, I think that has a lot to do with why we're not seeing those kind of results. But then so the coin example is like another example of a bias that we have to deal with, which is a very common thing in our collection, which is not necessarily sensitive, but it's something that we have to deal with, a challenge that it presents to us, because we have no control over the biases that we're seeing through the services that we're using. So it's an ongoing battle for refinement. And the only time I've seen any tags come through our process that's slightly questionable from a, when it comes to trying to categorize people, is that it sometimes misgenders people. So you do sometimes see women tagged as men, that kind of thing, but it's quite rare. But that's sort of the only type of tag that I've seen come through that, could potentially be problematic from in terms of categorizing people.
Thank you for sharing some of your project design decisions in this presentation as well, Jenna. I think that's actually really important to mention there, that the selections of collections that you've made. And actually you said that the slide with the recipe for how you accept the tags based on percentages doesn't look like much work, but I think anyone who's put together a project like that knows that is a lot of meetings and a lot of discussions and a lot of thinking that went into that thing.
Yes, and a lot of tweaking. Oh, just go up 0.5% or 1% or go down. Yeah, a lot of tweaking.
I have a question that might be related, and I'm not 100% sure if it is, but about neither. So both. I've been thinking about how to formulate it. Both the creation of a map and the taking of a photograph are not objective activities. There's an author or a creator, and often an intention in that work. I'm just wondering whether either you have any observations about whether that has had an impact on either your thinking about the project, like whether you are undermining the creator's intentions or enhancing the creator's intentions, or whether there is something about, or whether you've learned anything about how that impacts this application of these technologies to those sorts of collections.
Yeah, do you want to go, Jenna? Do you want to start?
No, you go.
I spoke to a couple of First Nations artists who work with maps really early in the project, because I'd been sort of guided that the maps are depictions of, the depictions of violence in many cases, of colonial theft, of land stolen and then sold to, largely to kind of wealthy Anglo colonists. And so I didn't want to do a project that would simply just like re-engineer like colonial violence into the future, but didn't know what to do that was different. And so I spoke to a few artists some of whom are kind of known for working in kind of mapping, and others who aren't. And their advice was to be really clear and acknowledge like the context the maps were generated. And so if you read the Mapping Future Vision or you hear me talk, you'll hear me reflect that, and to create conditions where people can have their own affordances and their own creativity, so they're not locked into recreating the mistakes of the past. And so that's why there's an interactive version of it. It's not just a passive consumption piece. You can make your own map, which is really cool. So that came out of those discussions. And also why I like necessarily frame the context for those, because the maps show incredible agency. That a person who's wealthy enough in 1880 or 1890, 1910 to be able to commission a map to be made, the first maps were all hand drawn. So like they had to pay someone to make the map, and then they had to print the map and then syndicate the map enough that it could then survive into these collections, a few hundred years later. So the reasons they made it and the power they had in order to create it and then to leave it as a legacy are a reflection of power. And they show a kind of, a very specific view of that time that is designed to support that person's needs. And so often they have like a real estate lens or a governmental lens or a land claim lens or a, whatever. Some of them are kind of benign, like don't build here, you'll get flooded. It's Brisbane, but other of them are not in the slightest bit benign. And so it is really tricky to build things that are not recreating the problems of the past when you're using the past as your source material to create your hopeful future. So yeah, like it was the hardest bit about the project, and almost stopped at the beginning until I was given enough information to be able to chart a course that wasn't problematic.
Oh, Jenny,
Jenny, you're muted.
I thought I unclicked it. There we go. So yeah, it's really interesting because I think for us it's a slightly different experience in that we weren't doing the training ourselves. So we weren't necessarily, but the tags that we get out of the Tiger process are not being trained on archival material. And but what we do see is biases from other, from these services. And I haven't had the opportunity to talk to too many creators of our collection material because so much of our material is so old that I couldn't if I wanted to speak with them. But I have had a couple of conversations with a few photographers where we have contemporary photographs of their collections where we've tagged them. And it's quite interesting what they find. They see that the tags are pulling out really sort of levels of detail that weren't necessarily important to them in the way that when they created it. So, and they often reflect the biases that we see in the services that we're using. So for example, there's one of the services, it tags a lot related to apparel. So it'll be a photo of people standing at the front of a building, shaking hands, and something really important's just happened. And it'll have the tag of shoes because they all happen to be wearing shoes. And it's like, well, okay, it's accurate, but also who cares that they're wearing shoes? And so they kind of find it a little bit entertaining. Obviously, it depends on the context, but we haven't really found, I wouldn't really necessarily say that the tags are misrepresenting the artist's intentions, but they certainly aren't necessarily picking up on the key details of images either. And often we find that what we would interpret as humans as the core sort of theme of an image is actually completely missed by the tagging process, because it is just trying to identify the things that it can see in that image. And so that's why I found the wedding example, quite interesting, because, just because she's wearing a white dress doesn't necessarily mean that it's a wedding. So there is some kind of semantic interpretation that's happening there. But mostly we don't see that level of interpretation. Like, for example, if it's a photo of a parade like the Mardi Gras or something like that, it will identify that there's costumes and that there's a crowd and that maybe there's dancers, but it doesn't understand the context of what the event actually is. So yeah, it's really interesting. It tends to, most people find some of the tags that, like what gets identified through the tagging process, as kind of quirky and not necessarily super useful in terms of painting the picture, but it helps to identify, specific elements within the images, which then, hopefully makes them more discoverable.
It's an interesting balance between the quirkiness plus the utility for different uses, like the things that Kia's talked about, plus the actual capturing of the cultural context. And perhaps this is the thing why we need many approaches in this sense as well. We had a great question in the chat, which won't actually have time for, about the changing conventions about even, when it comes to animal names or place names. over time, and how even common names of animals and that kind of thing, and how that might make tagging difficult. And I think we recalled the example of the pregnant woman hailing a taxi in Kier's presentation as well, that means something different from just a person waving. So, but we are running out of time, and I thank you very, very much for your presentations today. We could discuss this all afternoon. I would like to, a number of links have been shared in the chat there, and we will save those and ensure that they're added to the online listing for this video. Huge thanks to Kier and Jenna for their presentations today. I think they were fantastic. I'd also especially like to thank Ingrid and Rowan behind the scenes who've been helping out, as well as the rest of our AI for LAM AUNZ chapter. If you are interested in getting further involved in this group, I think Ingrid will share some links in the chat window here. And I'd also just like to flag, we haven't exactly fixed the date yet, but our June presentation will be looking at an ANU project about the Sydney Stock Exchange records that's been led by Catherine Dan and Tim Sherratt. So we will send that information out to participants in this webinar as soon as we can. We are always interested in showcasing new projects or interesting projects or discussions for this session. So please get in touch if you'd like something to be discussed at a future webinar. And with that, I'll say thank you to everyone and have a lovely day.
Die Schwachen sind die Kinder, sie kommen ganz leise und dann töten sie dich wie ein Tumor. Ist es Gott, der mich bestraft? Das werde ich wohl glauben müssen. Sonst würde ich an gar nichts